Good morning, dear students. Now as you know, we are talking about British novel, and now today we would like to discuss about the block number second, in which Pride and Prejudice is there in our syllabus. So, as you know, actually, Pride and Prejudice that was written by Jane Austen, and Jane Austen was a very famous English novelist whose works, romantic fiction set among the landed gentry, earned her a place as one of the most widely read writers in English literature. Her realism, biting irony, and social commentary have gained her historical importance among scholars and critics. Austen lived her entire life as part of a close-knit family located on the lower fringes of the English landed gentry. She was educated primarily by her father and older brothers, as well as through her own reading. The steadfast support of her family was critical to her development as a professional writer from her teenage years into her 30s. She experimented with various literary forms, including an epistolary novel which she then abandoned, wrote extensively revised three major novels, and began a fourth from 1811 until 1816 with the release of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. She achieved success as a published writer. She wrote two additional novels, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, both published posthumously in 1818. So put together, she was an experienced writer. Austen's works critique the nobles of sensibility of the second half of the 18th century and are part of the transition to the 19th century realism. Her plots, though fundamentally comic, highlight the dependence of women on marriage to secure socialist standing and economic security. Her works, though usually popular, but first published anonymously and brought her little personal fame and only a few positive reviews during her lifetime. But the publication in 1816 of her Nephews, a memoir of Jane Austen, introduced her to a wider public, and by the 1940s she had become widely accepted in academia as a great English writer. So actually, as a matter of fact, she was an accepted writer and very famous because of her only 6 works, you see, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, Persuasion. So only 6 works, and that is all about Jane Austen actually. Jane Austen's popularity lies only on these 6 novels. Pride and Prejudice is a novel of manners by Jane Austen, first published in 1813. The story follows the main character, Elizabeth Bennet, as she deals with issues of manners, upbringing, morality, education, and marriage in the society of the landed gentry of early 19th century England. So actually the novel talks about different things actually related to society, manners, marriages, morality, education, and different things. Elizabeth is the second of 5 daughters of a country gentleman living near the fictional town of Maryton in Hertfordshire near London. So this is a story of a family actually where the family members are living at Hertfordshire near London. Though the story is set at the turn of the 19th century, it retains a fascination for modern readers, continuing near the top of lists of most loved books. So actually this book, as we were talking about, my dear friends, this is considered one of the most loved books in English literature, such as the Big Read. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature and receives considerable attention from literary scholars. Modern interest in the book has resulted in a number of dramatic adaptations and an abundance of novels and stories imitating Austen's memorable characters or themes. So as we were talking, actually the book has got so many dramatic adaptations also, and so many stories have been also imitated from here. So as a matter of fact, the characters, the themes, the plot, everything has become very popular in English literature. Up to date, the book has sold some 20 million copies worldwide. So one of the most popular books in the history of English literature. As far as characters are concerned, actually, you see it has got memorable gallery of characters, so many important characters, and they are there everywhere, and these characters are very much important as far as the novel is concerned. So one of them is Elizabeth Bennet. Here we go for the characters. Elizabeth Bennet, the novel's protagonist, the second daughter of Mr. Bennet. Elizabeth is the most intelligent and sensible of the 5 Bennet sisters. She is most intelligent and sensible. She is well-read and quick-witted, with a tongue that occasionally proves too sharp for her own good. Her realization of Darcy's essential goodness eventually triumphs over her initial prejudice against him. Fitzwilliam Darcy, a wealthy gentleman, the master of Pemberley, and the nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Though Darcy is intelligent and honest, his excess of pride causes him to look down on his social inferiors. Over the course of the novel, he tempers his class consciousness and learns to admire and love Elizabeth for her strong character. Jane Bennet, the eldest and most beautiful Bennet sister. Jane is more reserved and gentler than Elizabeth. The easy pleasantness with which she and Bingley interact contrasts starkly with the mutual distaste that marks the encounters between Elizabeth and Darcy. So Jane Bennet is also a very beautiful sister and a very beautiful character also in the novel. And there is a kind of understanding between Jane Bennet and you see Mr. Bingley. Charles Bingley, you see, Darcy's considerably wealthy best friend. Bingley's purchase of Netherland, an estate near the Bennets, serves as the impetus for the novel. He is a genial, well-intentioned gentleman whose easygoing nature contrasts with Darcy's initially discourteous demeanor. He is blissfully uncaring about class differences. He is, you see, uncaring about anything, about class differences, etc. And this is why they had a good relationship. Mr. Bennet, the patriarch of the Bennet family, a gentleman of modest income with 5 unmarried daughters. He is the chief of the Bennet family, and you see Mr. Bennet has a sarcastic, cynical sense of humor that he uses to purposefully irritate his wife. So there is a kind of irritation between Mr. Bennet and his wife, and he teases his wife usually. Though he loves his daughters, Elizabeth in particular, he often fails as a parent, preferring to withdraw from the never-ending marriage concerns of the women around him rather than offer help. Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet's wife, a foolish, noisy woman whose only goal in life is to see her daughters married. Because of her low breeding and often unbecoming behavior, Mrs. Bennet often repels the very suitors whom she tries to attract for her daughters. George Bickham, a handsome, fortune-hunting military officer, becomes good looks and charm attract Elizabeth initially, but Darcy's revelation about Bickham's disreputable past clues her into his true nature and simultaneously draws her closer to Darcy. Lydia Bennet, the youngest Bennet sister, she is gossipy, immature, and self-involved. Unlike Elizabeth, Lydia flings herself headlong into romance and ends up running off with Bickham. Mr. Collins, a pompous, generally idiotic clergyman who stands to inherit Mr. Bennet's property. Mr. Collins' own social status is nothing to brag about, but he takes great pains to let everyone and anyone know that Lady Catherine de Bourgh serves as his patroness. He is the worst combination of snobbish and obsequious. Miss Bingley, Bingley's snobbish sister, Miss Bingley bears inordinate disdain for Elizabeth's middle-class background. Her vain attempts to garner Darcy's attention cause Darcy to admire Elizabeth's self-possessed character even more. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a rich, boozy noblewoman, Mr. Collins' patron and Darcy's aunt. Lady Catherine epitomizes class snobbery, especially in her attempts to order the middle-class Elizabeth away from her well-bred nephew. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife. The Gardiners, caring, nurturing, and full of common sense, often prove to be better parents to the Bennet daughters than Mr. Bennet and his wife. Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's dear friend, pragmatic, where Elizabeth is romantic, and also 6 years older than Elizabeth. Charlotte does not view love as the most vital component of a marriage. She is more interested in having a comfortable home. So actually, Charlotte does not view love as the most vital component of a marriage. She is always more interested in having a comfortable home. Thus, when Mr. Collins proposes, she accepts. Charlotte always actually is worried about a comfortable home and about the comfortable things related to life. Georgiana Darcy, Darcy's sister, she is immensely pretty and just as shy. She has great skill at playing the pianoforte. Mary Bennet, the middle Bennet sister, bookish and pedantic. So she is a middle Bennet sister and she is a bit bookish and she is much interested in the books and other things. Catherine Bennet, the fourth Bennet sister, like Lydia, she is girly, shy, and thrilled with the soldiers. So you see, we are talking about the important characters, and they are some important characters related to Pride and Prejudice. And you see, the main character is Elizabeth, as far as female characters are concerned. And for male characters, you see, Darcy is the important character, and the story actually develops for them. So they are the central parts of the story. And this is how the story further goes. Now we would like to discuss something about Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is a novel of manners by Jane Austen, first published in 1813. The story follows the main character, Elizabeth Bennet, as we were talking. She deals with issues of manners, upbringing, morality, education, and marriage in the society of early 19th century England. So as a matter of fact, Pride and Prejudice is talking about the different issues that are related to society, that are related to education, morality, marriage, and different things that were prevailing in 19th century England. Though the story is set at the turn of the 19th century, it retains a fascination for modern readers. You see, as we were talking initially, even just before 2 minutes, that you see the story is related to the 19th century because it expresses the time set of 19th century, but you see it has got a kind of different fascination, it has got a kind of attraction even for the modern readers. And you see, continuing near the top lists of most loved books in English literature. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature and receives considerable attention from literary scholars. Modern interest in the book has resulted in a number of dramatic adaptations and an abundance of novels and stories imitating Austen's memorable characters for themes. So you see, as we were talking, my dear friends, you see so many writers like it, scholarly critics like it actually, and you see so many imitations have been done. So it's a very important and very popular novel, Pride and Prejudice is. As far as summary is concerned, we would like to now discuss about summary. The novel centers on Elizabeth Bennet. She is the central character, my dear friends. She is the central character of this novel, Pride and Prejudice. And the second of the 5 daughters, she is the second one, the second of the 5 daughters of country gentleman, Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet is a bookish man and somewhat neglectful of his responsibilities. Mrs. Bennet is a woman lacking in social graces and primarily concerned with finding suitable husbands for her 5 daughters. And as we were talking even in the characterization, my dear friends, Mrs. Bennet is always worried, you see, about suitable husbands for her 5 daughters, you see. Jane Bennet, the eldest daughter, is distinguished by her kindness and beauty. Elizabeth Bennet shares her father's keen wit and occasionally sarcastic outlook. Mary is not pretty, but is studious, devout and musical, albeit lacking in taste. Kitty, the 4th sister, follows where her younger sister leads, while Lydia is flirtatious and unrestrained. Now here we go for plot, my dear friends. The narrative opens with news in the Bennet family that Mr. Bingley, a wealthy, charismatic and sociable young bachelor, is moving into Netherfield. You see, initially Mr. Bennet, you see Mr. Bingley, he is a wealthy person and a charismatic figure. He is just moving into Netherland Park in the neighborhood of Mr. Bennet and all. Mr. Bingley is soon well received, while his friend Mr. Darcy makes a less favorable impression by appearing proud and proud and condescending at a ball that they attend. He detests dancing and is not much for light conversation. Mr. Bingley singles out Jane for particular attention, and it soon becomes apparent that they have formed an attachment to each other. Though Jane does not alter her conduct for him, confessing her great happiness only to Lizzie. By contrast, Darcy slights Elizabeth, who overhears and jokes about it despite feeling a budding resentment. On paying a visit to Mr. Bingley's sister, Caroline, Jane is caught in a heavy downpour, catches cold, and is forced to stay at Netherfield for several days. Elizabeth arrives to nurse her sister and is thrown into frequent company with Mr. Darcy, who begins to act less coldly towards her. So this is how actually they start developing a kind of relationship, a kind of intimacy. On the other hand, Mr. Collins, a clergyman and heir to the Bennet estate, pays a visit to the Bennets. Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth are much amused by his veneration of his employer, the noble Lady Catherine, as well as by his self-important and pedantic nature. It soon becomes apparent that Mr. Collins has come to Longbourn to choose a wife from among the Bennet sisters, his cousins, and Elizabeth is singled out. She instead forms an acquaintance with Mr. Bickham, a military officer who relates having been very seriously mistreated by Mr. Darcy, despite having been a godson and favorite of Darcy's father. This insight and her attraction to Mr. Bickham increase Elizabeth's dislike of Mr. Darcy. At a ball given by Mr. Bingley at Netherfield, Mr. Darcy becomes aware of a general expectation that Mr. Bingley and Jane will marry. So there actually, you see, there was a ball party and there it was an expectation from all over that Mr. Bingley and Jane will marry after some time, and the Bennet family, with the exception of Jane and Elizabeth, make a public display of poor manners and decorum. The following morning, Mr. Collins proposes marriage to Elizabeth, who refuses him, much to her mother's distress. Mr. Collins recovers and promptly becomes engaged to Elizabeth's close friend, Charlotte Lucas, a homely woman with few prospects. Mr. Bingley abruptly quits Netherfield and returns to London, devastating Jane, and Elizabeth becomes convinced that Mr. Darcy and Caroline Bingley have colluded to separate him from Jane. Jane is persuaded by letters from Caroline Bingley that Mr. Bingley is not in love with her, but goes on an extended visit to her aunt and Uncle Gardiner in London in the hope of maintaining her relationship with Caroline, if not with Charles Bingley. While there she visits Caroline and eventually her visit is returned. She does not see Mr. Bingley and is forced to realize that Caroline doesn't care for her. In the spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Kent. Elizabeth and her hosts are frequently invited to Rogings Park, home of Lady Catherine, Darcy's aunt. Coincidentally, Darcy also arrives to visit. Elizabeth meets Darcy's cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who vouches for Darcy's loyalty, using as an example how Darcy had recently stepped in on behalf of a friend who had formed an attachment to a woman against whom there were some very strong objections. Elizabeth rightly assumes that the said friend is none other than Mr. Bingley, and her dislike of Darcy deepens. thus she is of no mood to accept when Darcy arrives, and quite unexpectedly confesses love for her and begs her hand in marriage. His proposal is flattering. He is a very distinguished man, but it is delivered in a manner ill-suited to recommend it. He talks of love but also of revulsion at her inferior position and family. Despite assertions to the contrary, he assumes she will accept him. Elizabeth rebukes him, and a heated discussion follows. She charges him with destroying her sister's and Bingley's happiness, with treating Mr. Bickham disgracefully, and with having conducted himself towards her in an arrogant, ungentlemanlike manner. Mr. Darcy, shocked, ultimately responds with a letter giving a good account of his actions. Bickham had exchanged his legacies for a cash payment, only to return after frittering away the money to reclaim the forfeited inheritance. He then attempted to elope with Darcy's young sister Georgiana, and thereby secure her fortune for himself. Regarding Jane and Bingley, Darcy claims he had observed no reciprocal interest in Jane for Bingley, and had assumed her not to be in love with him. In addition to this, he cites the want of propriety in the behavior of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and her three young daughters. Elizabeth, who had previously despaired over this very behavior, is forced to admit the truth of Mr. Darcy's observations, and begins to wonder whether she has misjudged him. Elizabeth tells her father that Darcy was responsible for uniting Lydia and Bickham. This is one of the two earliest illustrations of Pride and Prejudice. The clothing style reflects the time the illustration was engraved, not the time the novel was written or set. Some months later, Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle Gardiner visit Pemberley, Darcy's estate, believing he will be absent for the day. He returns unexpectedly, and though surprised, he is gracious and welcoming. He treats the Gardiners with great civility, surprising Elizabeth, who assumes he will decamp immediately on learning who they are. Darcy introduces Elizabeth to his sister, and Elizabeth begins to acknowledge her attraction to him. Their reacquaintance is cut short, however, by the news that Lydia has eloped with Mr. Bickham. Elizabeth and the Gardiners return to Longbourn, the Bennet family home where they used to live, where Elizabeth grieves that her renewed acquaintance with Mr. Darcy will end as a result of her sister's disgrace. Lydia and Bickham are soon found and persuaded to marry, thus enabling the Bennet family to preserve some appearance of decorum. Jane, Elizabeth, and Mr. Bennet realize that their uncle Gardiner must have bribed Bickham to marry Lydia, and are ashamed of their indebtedness and inability to repay him. Mrs. Bennet, quite typically, has no such scruples and is ecstatic. Mr. and Mrs. Bickham visit Longbourn, where Lydia lets slip that Mr. Darcy was in attendance at their wedding, but that was to have been a secret. Elizabeth is able to discover by letter from her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, that in fact Mr. Darcy was responsible for finding the couple and negotiating their marriage at great personal and momentary expense. Elizabeth is shocked and flattered, as her heart did whisper that he had done it for her, but is unable to dwell further on the topic due to Mr. Bingley's return and subsequent proposal to Jane, who immediately accepts. Lady Catherine de Bourgh pays an unexpected visit to Longbourn. She has heard a rumor that Elizabeth will marry Mr. Darcy, and attempts to persuade Elizabeth to agree not to marry. Lady Catherine wants Mr. Darcy to marry her daughter, Anne de Bourgh, and thinks Elizabeth is beneath him. Elizabeth refuses her demands. Disgusted, Lady Catherine leaves, promising that the marriage can never take place. Elizabeth assumes she will apply to Darcy and is worried that he may be persuaded. Darcy returns to Longbourn. Chance allows Elizabeth and Darcy a rare moment alone. She immediately thanks him for intervening in the case of Lydia and Bickham. He renews his proposal of marriage and is promptly accepted. Elizabeth soon learns that his hopes were revived by his aunt's report of Elizabeth's refusal to promise not to marry him. So thus, the novel closes with a happily ever after chapter, including a summary of the remaining lives of the main characters. There is no description of either Jane or Elizabeth's wedding. None of the characters change very much in this summary, but Kitty has grown slightly more sensible from association with Jane and Elizabeth, and distance from Lydia, and Lady Catherine condensed to visit the Darcys eventually. So there is a kind of happy ending actually, there is a kind of happy relationship, so that actually takes place in the end. As far as themes are related, so here we go for themes. The opening line of the novel announces, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This sets the marriage motive of the novel. It turns out that rather than the man being in want of a wife, the woman is in want of a husband who is in possession of good fortune. Charlotte Lucas, Lydia Bennet, Jane Bennet, Elizabeth Bennet get married to men who are sufficiently appropriate for each of them. Marriage becomes an economic rather than social activity. In the case of Charlotte, the seeming success of the marriage lies in the comfortable economy of their household. The relationship of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet serves to illustrate all that a marriage relationship should not be. Elizabeth and Darcy marry each other on equal terms after breaking each other's pride and prejudice, and Austen clearly leaves the reader with the impression that the two will be the happiest. Then money plays a key role in marriage market, not only for the young ladies seeking a well-off husband, but also for men who wish to marry a woman of means. Two examples are George Bickham, who tried to elope with Georgiana Darcy, and Colonel Fitzwilliam. Marrying a woman of a rich family also ensured a linkage to a high family, as is visible in the desires of Bingley's sisters to have their brother married to Georgiana Darcy. Inheritance was governed by laws of entailment. When there was no heir to the estate, the family had to entail its fortune to a distant cousin. In the case of the Bennet family, Mr. Collins was to inherit, and his proposal to Elizabeth would have allowed her to have a share. Nevertheless, she refused his offer. Inheritance laws benefited males because most women did not have independent legal rights until the second half of the 19th century. As a consequence, women's financial security at the time the novel is set dependent on men. For the upper middle and aristocratic classes, marriage to a man with a reliable income was almost the only road to security for the woman and her future children. Much of the pride and prejudice in the novel exists because of the class divisions. Darcy's first impressions on Elizabeth are colored by his snobbery. He cannot bring himself to love Elizabeth, or at least acknowledge his love for her even in his own heart because of his pride. His first proposal clearly reflects this attitude. In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Also, Elizabeth quickly believes Bickham's account of Darcy because of her prejudice against him. Lady Catherine and the Bingley sisters belong to the snobbish category. Mr. Bingley shows complete disregard to the class. Elizabeth and Darcy were not born a great match. It is through their interactions and their critiques of each other that they recognize their faults and work to correct them. Elizabeth mediates on her own mistakes thoroughly in chapter 36. How deprecably have I acted, she cried. I who have prided myself on my discernment, I who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blameless distrust. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation. Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind, but vanity, not love, has been my folly, pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other. On the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance. and driven reason away, where either were concerned till this moment. I never knew myself. So this was actually the theme of self-knowledge. And style. Pride and Prejudice, like most of Jane Styles' works, employs the narrative technique of free indirect speech. This has been defined as the free representation of a character's speech, by which one means not words actually spoken by a character, but the words that typify the character's thoughts or the way the character would think or speak if she thought or spoke, by using narrative that adopts the tone and vocabulary of a particular character. Austen invites the reader to follow events from Elizabeth's viewpoint, sharing her prejudices and misapprehensions. The learning curve, while undergone by both protagonists, is disclosed to us solely through Elizabeth's point of view, and her free indirect speech is essential. For it is through it that we remain caught, if not stuck, within Elizabeth's mispresence. So this is how actually these themes are related with each other, and Pride and Prejudice is also balanced through its themes actually. I hope you must have understood the idea of Pride and Prejudice. Thank you.